respectfully said, "Junior greets Uncle Danielson." Stevie Danielson looked at him, nodded, and said, "From your accent, young man, you must be from Yinzhou, correct?" Charles Justice promptly replied, saying he was from Handan. Stevie Danielson remarked, "Yinzhou is home to many heroes, and West Mountain is full of merchants. As descendants of noble families, we must support each other in times of hardship." William Blade stood up and said, "The Williams couple is not like us, accustomed to the ways of the martial world. They cannot travel the mountain paths on horseback, so I've arranged a sedan chair for them. I hope Brother Danielson can write us a travel permit to ease our journey." Stevie Danielson nodded and said, "I will certainly take care of this. After breakfast tomorrow morning, you can come to the county office in Pinglo to collect the travel permit." William Blade replied, "Thank you." The master and disciple bid farewell to the host and returned to the inn. Early the next morning, Charles Justice woke up, and at that moment, Philip Gale entered, tossing him a plain long robe, saying, "Take off your armor and put on this outfit. Our identities have changed. You must remember, we are now escorts for the family of General Paul Levine's subordinate traveling to Grand Continent." Charles Justice nodded in agreement, then asked, "Do we need to change how we address each other?" Philip Gale replied, "That's not necessary." After finishing breakfast, Charles Justice instructed everyone to change into light, casual attire. He also arranged for an additional sedan chair. William Blade invited Lady Williams to sit in the sedan chair and hired 2 local strong men to carry it. The rest of the group mounted their horses. William then said to Ethan Williams, "Young Master Williams, you lead everyone out of the city first. I will go to the yamen to retrieve the travel documents and catch up later." Ethan Williams agreed and led the group ahead. At the northern gate of Pingla City, the guards, seeing the group was large and unfamiliar, stopped them for questioning. Philip Gale explained, "We are escorting General Williams' family to meet General Paul Levine in Disha." The guard, speaking in the West Mountain dialect, responded, "I've been stationed here for 40 years, and I've never heard of a General Williams in these parts." Ethan Williams stepped forward and said, "I am a general who has spent years campaigning away from home. Naturally, you wouldn't know me." At that moment, the sound of horse hooves approached from behind and stopped nearby. William Blade arrived, handed the travel documents to the guard, and said, "These were issued by your magistrate, Danielson. Take a good look." After examining the documents, the guard quickly allowed them to leave the city. However, because of the sedan chair, their travel speed was significantly reduced. It took them a full day and night to reach Yincheng. William Blade dismissed the 2 strong men and the sedan chair, then purchased a horse-drawn carriage. With the carriage, their travel speed improved, but they still could not catch up to the 100 cavalrymen led by George Freeman. Robert Rising and George Freeman took the main road directly to Dishu. Although their route was much longer than the one taken by William Blade and his group, the cavalry traveled day and night. They also placed informants along the main road from the northern part of Taiyuan to Dishu, under the orders of Prince Tang. However, these informants did not recognize Edward Williams' family or William Blade's group, relying solely on accents to identify them. By late April, the weather had turned hot. Fortunately, heavy rain fell, and William Blade led the group to take shelter in a small roadside temple along the main road. Ethan Williams remarked, "So far, the journey has been smooth. It seems the treacherous court officials can only throw their weight around in the capital." William Blade cautioned, "Young Master Williams, don't let your guard down. Do you remember George Freeman, the man who once captured you? If it were just Robert Rising, he wouldn't be a threat. But George Freeman, being a military officer and holding a grudge against you, will definitely not let this go." Ethan Williams, whose arm wound had already healed, calmly replied, Once I reach General Levine's territory, we'll see who is truly more formidable. Philip Gale spoke in a low voice. I have received news from Mr. Lee. They have already reached General Levine, but they've lost young Master Tomas along the way. General Levine has sent people to search for him. Everyone was overjoyed upon hearing this. When the rain stopped, they resumed their journey. After traveling a short distance, they saw two riders galloping toward them from the front. The riders stopped abruptly, blocking their path. Ethan Williams looked up and was startled. It was none other than Robert Rising and George Freeman. He thought to himself, could this really be such a coincidence? We just mentioned them, and now they've appeared. He then loosened the reins and reached for the pair of short batons hidden in his sleeves. William Blade, however, signaled with his eyes for Ethan not to act rashly. He raised his voice and said, "Gentlemen, please make way." Robert Rising said, "There's no need to hide anymore. We're here to capture." "You?" Edward Williams and his wife, upon hearing this, hid inside the carriage, extremely tense. William Blade spoke in a deep voice. "I see that the two of you are young and have a bright future ahead. I don't wish to take your lives. Open your eyes and don't waste them." Hearing this, Robert Rising quickly signaled to George Freeman and glanced toward both sides. William Blade also quickly looked toward the sides of the road, noticing shadows of people lurking in the forest on either side. It was clear an ambush had been set. Silently gathering his inner strength, he prepared for battle but still spoke softly. "If this were not the capital city, and if you knew the origin and background of young Master Williams, you'd realize none of you could stand against us." After listening, George Freeman immediately tightened his grip on his broadsword and coldly declared, "Under the orders of Lord Arthur Queen, we are here to capture the criminal Ethan Williams and his family. If there's resistance, no mercy will be shown." With that, he spurred his horse forward. Ethan Williams quickly warned his parents inside the carriage. "Father, mother, be on guard." Then he drew his dual batons. William Blade instructed, "Disciple, watch your master's techniques carefully. When we have time later, I'll teach you." George Freeman coldly retorted, "I fear there won't be a later." As he finished speaking, he swung his broadsword horizontally and charged forward on horseback. William Blade shouted, "Junior brother, take them to the rear. Ensure their safety." Philip Gale promptly obeyed, turned his horse around, and rode toward a small temple behind them. Ethan Williams and Charles Justice stayed behind, one observing the fight intently, the other itching for action. As the broadsword slashed horizontally, William Blade channeled his energy into his right hand and struck with a palm attack. The force of the palm collided with the blade, and he shouted, "Don't blame me for not giving you a chance." George Freeman felt a powerful force press against his broadsword, causing his mount to stagger and push him backward. He quickly pulled the reins, and his warhorse neighed loudly, rearing up. William Blade said, "This is your final chance. If you don't step aside, I will go through you." George Freeman responded, "Old man, such arrogance. Let me see what you're capable of." With that, he spurred his horse forward, raising his blade to strike. William Blade leaned to the side to dodge, leapt into the air, and soared over the horse's back. Extending his left foot, he stepped onto the flat of the blade that had just been slashed horizontally. George Freeman was startled by this, and quickly withdrew his sword, dismounting from his horse in haste. He swung his blade again, but William Blade extended his right hand, grasped the flat of the sword, and pressed it down. His left hand formed a fist, with his index finger pointing forward, releasing a burst of sword energy. George Freeman tilted his head just in time, but the energy knocked off his helmet. Robert Rising, witnessing this, was alarmed and quickly signaled. Immediately, 100 armored cavalry emerged from behind the trees, charging towards the main road. The leading knight, seeing the two locked in combat, exclaimed in surprise, "So it's them." This man was the leader of the cavalry William Blade had encountered earlier outside the simple battlefield. George Freeman's horizontal blade had already fallen from his grasp. Struggling, he climbed back onto his horse and shouted, "Shoot the arrows." William Blade swiftly delivered a kick to his side, causing him to spit blood and collapse over his horse's back. Taking advantage of the opportunity, William spurred his horse and fled. Robert Rising, seeing this, also attempted to escape towards the main road, shouting orders, "Shoot the arrows, quickly shoot." The cavalrymen immediately drew their bows, nocked their arrows, and aimed at their targets. William Blade grabbed the horizontal saber and said to his disciple, "Take it, leave quickly." Charles Justice saw the horizontal saber flying towards him and hurriedly reached out to grab the hilt, but he felt the saber was extremely heavy. Ethan Williams immediately struck the mount of his horse and charged through the cavalry, chasing after George Freeman. The cavalry eventually gave up and began shooting arrows. William Blade instantly tore off his long robe, leapt into the air, and swung the robe, deflecting all the arrows. Charles Justice also quickly gripped the horizontal saber tightly, blocking one arrow. He thought to himself, "This saber is so heavy, thank goodness Master deflected the arrows." He quickly turned his horse around and headed toward the temple. At that moment, a large group of cavalry appeared from the main road, raising high banners, all clad in gleaming armor. Seeing this, George Freeman was overjoyed and immediately urged his horse forward to seek help. However, Ethan Williams had caught up, sweeping Robert Rising off his horse with a single strike. Just as he was about to pursue George Freeman, he noticed the advancing army, startling him. Gripping his iron staff tightly, he prepared to fight to the death. Chapter 22, Episode 22, Armored Beauty. On the main road to Taicho, a fierce battle was taking place. A group of cavalrymen joined forces to besiege an old man, but the more the old man fought, the fiercer he became, causing the cavalrymen to fall off their horses in utter disarray. Ahead, George Freeman raced toward the main army, pleading for protection. Ethan Williams, seeing the military banner ahead, breathed a sigh of relief upon noticing the large word, "Levine," emblazoned on it. Suddenly, a sharp and commanding voice rang out, "Capture him!" Hearing this, George Freeman was overjoyed. Despite his internal injuries, he straightened himself on horseback, casting a smug glance at Ethan Williams, who was chasing behind him. Ethan clenched his twin maces tightly, gritting his teeth as he continued the pursuit. Suddenly, two cavalrymen galloped ahead, throwing ropes to bind George Freeman tightly and pulling him off his horse. George's face turned pale, and he shouted loudly, "The enemy is ahead! Why are you arresting me?" Ethan Williams caught up and, seeing the scene, swung his twin maces directly at George Freeman's head as he lay bound. George Freeman, seeing the maces descending and unable to dodge, closed his eyes, resigning himself to death. A sharp clashing sound echoed as a burly officer with a broad chest and a tiger-like stance swung his blade horizontally, deflecting the maces. That same commanding voice spoke again. "General Williams, do not act rashly. Spare this wretch's life and leave him for General Levine to deal with." Ethan Williams withdrew his maces and looked toward the speaker, recognizing him as Kimmy Bao, the bodyguard of Paul Levine. Ethan clasped his hands in salute and said, "Kimmy Bao, your arrival is timely. Then I shall spare him for now." Kimmy Bao ordered his subordinates to bind both George Freeman and Robert Rising, then led the soldiers forward, commanding the cavalry ahead to stop fighting. William Blade, seeing the main army approaching, leapt in front of Kimmy Bao's horse, startling the soldiers under Kimmy Bao's command, who drew their swords in defense. Kimmy Bao, however, said, "Senior William Blade, it has been a long time. It is truly good to see you again. William Blade nodded and replied, These cavalrymen are yours to handle. Kimmy Bao nodded in acknowledgement and shouted toward the 100 cavalrymen, Hear me! Your 2 leaders have been captured by me. Return to your posts immediately, or face imprisonment in General Levine's camp and a beating. The cavalrymen looked at him, and their leader stepped forward, saying, I am Yuan Style, formerly the leader of the cavalry under General Wes Lee, stationed in Chang'an. I was later reassigned to Luoyang by Victoria, under orders from Lord Arthur Queen. Now that you have captured our 2 superiors, we must return to the capital and report this matter to Lord Wu. Kimmy Bao replied, Do as you wish. I was sent by General Levine to welcome Deputy General Williams. I do not fear Arthur Queen's wrath. Hearing this, Yuan Style immediately regrouped his 100 cavalrymen, turned their horses, and headed back toward Taiyuan City. Kimmy Bao then clasped his hands in salute toward Ethan Williams and asked, Brother, I have heard of the injustice against the Williams family. Such vile schemes and wrongful accusations. Fortunately, your entire family managed to escape the capital. Where are your relatives now? Ethan Williams lowered his maces and replied, We were just pursued by 100 cavalrymen led by George Freeman. My family has taken refuge in a small temple nearby. Kimmy Bao commanded the main army to follow Ethan Williams and William Blade to the small temple, where they found Edward Williams and his wife, still trembling in fear. Edward Williams expressed his gratitude to Kimmy Bao and inquired about his daughter's situation. As they followed the main army toward Daizhou, they conversed along the way. Kimmy Bao explained, Master Li is escorting Miss Williams, along with soldiers dispatched by General Levine, to West Mountain to meet young Master Chi. Miss Lily Carter, due to the long journey and her frail condition, has remained at the General's residence to recover. He then turned to William Blade and added, Miss Williams brought along the black iron sword you gifted her for protection. She mentioned she would return it to you once she comes back. William Blade said, No rush, you all appeared at just the right time. How is General Levine doing? Kimmy Bao nodded and replied, Miss Levine still remembers the person who taught her martial arts. Hearing about Miss Levine, Charles Justice thought to himself, This Miss Levine also likes martial arts. I wonder what kind of woman she is. In his impression, women usually stayed at home learning domestic skills, waiting for the day they got married. Under the escort of the Golden Leopard Army, the group quickly arrived at Daizhou and entered Paul Levine's residence. Another guard said, General Levine is away on official duties and not at the residence. He instructed me to arrange accommodations for Deputy General Williams' family. I am Yuan Sa. He then led Edward Williams' family to a small estate on the outskirts of Daizhou and said to Ethan Williams, This place was purchased by one of General Levine's guards. Unfortunately, that guard sacrificed his life in battle. General Levine bought back this estate, handed over the funds and compensation to the guard's family, but they remarried and moved elsewhere. So, this estate has been vacant. You can stay here with peace of mind? Ethan Williams asked, When will General Levine be able to return? Yuan Sa replied, General Levine has gone to inspect Yanmen Pass. He should return soon. After saying that, he took out 2 letters and handed them to Ethan. Here are 2 letters, one from General Levine to you, and the other from Miss Williams. Ethan Williams thanked him. At that moment, Charles Justice and Peter Justice also entered the room. They saw Lily Carter lying pale on the bed. When she saw them, she tried to sit up but couldn't. Edward Williams hurriedly stepped forward and said, I heard you're feeling unwell. Just rest. Lily Carter spoke in a hoarse voice. It's nothing serious. I've already seen a doctor. As long as I take my medicine regularly and rest, I'll recover. After Ethan Williams arranged accommodations for his parents, William Blade and his disciples came over and said, "Your family can stay here with peace of mind. Our mission is complete. We plan to wait for General Levine's return, but we have other matters to attend to, so we must take our leave." With that, he called Charles Justice over. William Blade said to his disciple, "This place is not far from your hometown, Handan. You can write a letter and ask someone to deliver it home to let your parents know you're safe." Charles Justice replied, "Why not let Peter Justice return home too? It's not very convenient for him to follow me around." Peter Justice said, "No, I want to stay and serve the young master." William Blade replied, "Both of you can follow me back to Manhwa. Peter Justice, though still young, is loyal to his master. Do not let him return." At that moment, the sound of horse hooves echoed from outside the door. Yuan saw at the entrance announced, "Subordinate greets Miss Levine." The sound of hooves stopped at the door, and everyone hurried to the courtyard. From the grand gate entered a woman clad in silver armor. Seeing everyone, she spoke in a clear voice, "Uncle William Blade, I've finally waited long enough for you to arrive." Charles Justice quickly turned to look at the woman. She wore no helmet, her hair tied in a three-pronged bun. Her complexion was fair, her willow-leaf eyebrows framed bright eyes, and her oval face exuded a fresh and clear voice like silver bells. William Blade remarked, "Fire, it's been years since we last met. You've grown into a beautiful young lady, more and more stunning by the day." As he spoke, Mrs. Levine approached Charles Justice. Edward Williams also stepped out upon hearing the commotion. William Blade introduced them to one another. Mrs. Williams, looking at Miss Levine, was filled with both surprise and joy. She said, "Let's all go inside to talk." Miss Levine nodded in agreement, and then turned back toward William Blade. William Blade commented, "You've grown taller too." His disciple quietly compared his height to Miss Levine's, realizing she was a full head taller than him, leaving him inwardly frustrated. After William Blade introduced her to Ethan Williams, he invited everyone inside for a conversation. Miss Levine glanced at Charles Justice and said, "How did Uncle William Blade take you as his disciple? I haven't even had the chance to formally become his student." Charles Justice blushed slightly, unsure of how to respond. William Blade interjected, "I fear my martial arts might hold others back. How could I dare to recklessly take Miss Levine as my disciple?" As everyone sat talking in the main hall, Charles Justice couldn't help but steal glances at Miss Levine. Though she was the daughter of a noble family, she exuded a bold and heroic aura, entirely different from Miss Williams. At that moment, Miss Levine, while speaking, noticed Charles Justice sneaking a look at her. She met his gaze with an authoritative expression, prompting him to quickly lower his head. William Blade said, "We are planning to return to Manhwa soon, and may not have the chance to bid farewell to General Levine." Miss Levine, hearing this, quickly replied, "Uncle, don't leave in such haste. My father still has much to discuss with you." Philip Gale said, "But there are still many matters at Manhwa that we need to handle." Miss Levine replied, "Then, Uncle Master, you should return first. I will escort Uncle Tan to Yemen Pass to meet my father. The Turkic army keeps lingering outside the pass without attacking. It's so frustrating to watch." William Blade smiled but said nothing. Charles Justice remarked, "Isn't it better that they don't attack? If the Turkic army launches an assault, many lives will be lost, and General Levine might also be in danger." Mrs. Levine glared at him and retorted, "Cowardly men like you who fear death are truly rare." Charles Justice's face immediately turned beet red. Ethan Williams interjected, "That's not the case. What Charles Justice said isn't wrong. While it's the duty of us soldiers to defend the nation and fight the enemy, we all hope for a world without war and bloodshed." Mrs. Levine turned to him and asked, "General Williams, Despite your countless battles, have you now grown fearful? Ethan Williams responded, I have stood with General Wing to guard the northern borders of the Tang Empire, engaging in countless battles against the Turks without ever retreating. However, I simply wish for no more wars to occur. Mrs. Loving said, If you don't want to go to battle, I'll ask my father to arrange a position as a martial arts instructor for you. It's much safer. Ethan Williams hurriedly thanked her. William Blade said, I would also like to meet General Loving again. But, before he could finish, Miss Loving interrupted, saying, I heard from my father that at the border, there's an old bald man in plain clothes who's been walking around with a wolf. William Blade was startled upon hearing this and quickly said, That old man must be truly formidable. Charles Justice, curious, asked, Could it be just a large dog? Mrs. Loving replied, My father saw it with his own eyes. Do you think my father can't tell the difference between a wolf and a dog? We've lived at the border for a long time. We rarely see dogs, but we see wolves all the time. Charles Justice said, Isn't the old man afraid of being eaten by the wolf? William Blade explained, The nomadic tribes often keep fierce beasts as pets, but taming a wolf as a pet is extremely rare. Wolves are notoriously difficult to domesticate due to their wild nature. Mrs. Loving playfully added, So, Uncle, do you want to go see that old man? Charles Justice eagerly looked at his master, hoping he would agree. William Blade said, But the border is dangerous, and my disciple has just joined the sect. His martial arts skills are still shallow. I'm afraid going there might put everyone at risk. Hearing this, Charles Justice became displeased and said, Then let Peter Justice stay behind. My martial arts skills have improved a lot already. Mrs. Loving turned around and stared at him, saying, Oh really? Then I want to challenge you, and see what skills you truly possess to dare to become Minister Blade's disciple. Everyone present, except for Miss Loving, was well aware of Charles Justice's martial arts prowess. Naturally, they didn't want him to spar with Miss Loving, so they remained silent. William Blade said, Is there even a need for a duel? Of course, Miss Loving's martial skills are superior. Just look at your stature. You're already shorter than her. Miss Loving, upon hearing this, said, No duel is necessary then. In that case, Uncle, agree to accompany me to Jade Gate Pass to meet my father. If you're afraid of danger, your disciple can stay behind. Charles Justice, feeling utterly reluctant, replied, I merely dislike war. When have I ever been afraid? I've even been to Illumination Prison. What else is there to fear? Miss Loving looked at him with disbelief in her eyes and said, All right, then let's go to Jade Gate Pass together to meet my father. Charles Justice quickly agreed, deciding to leave Peter Justice behind to take care of Lily Carter. Miss Loving stood up, preparing to leave. As she approached Charles Justice, she suddenly stopped, leaned in close, and whispered, The scenery beyond the pass is particularly beautiful, and there's even an old man walking a wolf. Shall we sneak out together? Charles Justice felt her orchid-like breath so close to him, and his heart couldn't help but flutter. Unsure of how to respond, he simply nodded. Miss Loving quickly walked out, saying, I'll wait for you at the General's mansion. The sooner, the better. William Blade came over and asked, What did Miss Loving just say to you? Charles Justice quickly snapped out of his daze and replied, Nothing. Mrs. Williams asked, Does anyone know if a beauty like Miss Loving is already betrothed? William Blade answered, I'm not sure about that. I've never heard General Loving mention it. But with her tall stature, it might be difficult for her to find a husband. Hashtag chapter 23, episode 23, Escape from the military camp. When the servants fell ill, the master had to take on the duties of the household staff. Ethan Williams called Charles Justice and Peter Justice to the kitchen to cook for everyone. Charles Justice, who didn't know how to cook even at home, found himself following Ethan Williams' lead. Ethan, being more experienced, directed the two to rinse rice, wash vegetables, and start the fire. As the three busied themselves, Charles Justice suddenly asked, "Mr. Williams, do you have a sweetheart?" Ethan Williams paused for a moment before replying, "Why are you suddenly asking about this? I haven't even thought about marriage yet. This isn't something someone your age should be concerned with." Peter Justice interjected, "But back in our village, men your age are already married, and some even have children." Ethan Williams responded, "That's exactly why they're stuck in the village their whole lives, unable to achieve anything great." The two were left speechless by his reply. Ethan then added, "A true man should focus on building his career first. How can one aspire to accomplish great things if entangled in matters of romance?" At that moment, a voice suddenly came from behind. "But we're all growing old, and the Williams family depends on heirs to carry on the lineage. You're the only son of the Williams family. How can you shirk this responsibility?" The three turned toward the voice and saw it was Elder Williams. Edward Williams said, "The prestige of the Williams family has been in decline. During the previous dynasty, your great-grandfather held the esteemed position of Duke Protector. Even in the Tang era, the court still respected our family." Ethan Williams replied, "To restore the glory of the Williams family and reclaim the title of Duke Protector, I fear that is beyond my abilities." Edward Williams said, "It's all right. After you get married and have children, I will personally guide them. I will ensure they bring glory to our Williams family." Ethan Williams, unsure whether he was ashamed of his own inadequacy or embarrassed by the topic of his marriage, blushed deeply. Edward Williams asked, "What do you think of Miss Levine?" Charles Justice, hearing this, felt a bit annoyed but quickly thought to himself, "What does Miss Levine have to do with me anyway? Why am I even bothered?" Ethan Williams remained silent, which made the elder anxious. He urged, "Say something. Do you think you're not worthy of Miss Levine?" Ethan Williams replied, "We've just arrived in Dachau. I want to wait until we settle down first. At the very least, we should wait for General Levine to return before discussing this further." Edward Williams responded, "Foolish boy. You could accompany Miss Levine to Yunnan Pass to meet General Levine." He then whispered to him, "If you miss this chance, there might not be another one in the future." After lunch, Charles Justice eagerly requested his master to take him to General Levine's residence to meet Miss Levine. Edward Williams also urged his son to go with him. At this moment, Peter Justice felt left out and was unwilling to stay behind. Charles Justice remarked, "The journey will be tough. If you don't want to stay, you can return to Manhwa with Uncle Gale." Peter Justice replied, "Then I'd rather stay and wait for the young master." Philip Gale bid farewell to everyone, mounted his horse, and departed. Not long after, another horse galloped to the front gate. Miss Levine dismounted gracefully and asked, "Are you all ready? Let's go!" Behind her, a few cavalrymen from the Golden Armor Guard also arrived. William Blade had already prepared himself, calling out to his excited disciples. After stepping out of the courtyard, he mounted his horse. Ethan Williams hurriedly followed, saying, "Miss Levine, I would like to accompany you to pay my respects to General Levine." Miss Levine stared at him and replied, "All right, but after meeting my father, don't follow me around anymore." Ethan Williams was slightly confused, but, seeing her already spurring her horse forward, quickly mounted his own horse and followed. Yunnan Pass was located north of Dachau, requiring 2 days of travel to reach. As night fell, Miss Levine led them to a postal station to rest. William Blade and his disciple shared a room. Charles Justice, inspecting the curved blade he had recently obtained, brought it along on this journey to Yunnan Pass as a precaution. His master asked, I can tell you really like that curved blade, don't you? Charles Justice quickly replied. Previously, when Ethan Williams and I sparred, he mentioned that I had no weapon and would be defenseless in dangerous situations. It's true I didn't have any weapon then, but now with this long blade, I feel much more secure. William Blade explained. This is called a curved blade. It's a weapon used by the cavalry of the Tang dynasty. Its thick and heavy spine makes it difficult for those without strength to wield. If you have time, I can teach you a few curved blade techniques. Charles Justice then pulled out a book gifted to him by Arthur Wing from his chest pocket. Opening it, he found an entry about the curved blade and asked, Master, people in the martial world call you Minister Blade, but why don't you carry a sword? William Blade replied, Didn't I gift my black iron sword to Miss Williams for her protection? In the adjacent room, Mrs. Loving was about to rest when she heard someone knocking on the door. She opened it to see Ethan Williams and asked in surprise, What brings you here? Ethan Williams, standing at the door, replied, My parents wish for me to marry soon to continue the Williams family lineage. Mrs. Loving said, Then you should marry soon and ease your parents' worries. Besides, I heard your younger sister and Mr. Loy are already engaged. If you delay your marriage, won't it also delay your sister's wedding? Ethan Williams quickly explained, No, Miss Loving. My parents hope I can propose to your father. What do you think about this? Hearing this, Mrs. Loving's heart raced, and her face flushed red. She immediately closed the door and said, My ideal partner hasn't appeared yet. At the very least, he must be taller than me. With that, she lay on her bed, covering her face with both hands. Ethan Williams stood there, stunned. The next morning, after everyone washed up and had breakfast, they mounted their horses and continued their journey to Yan'an Pass. This time, it only took a day to arrive. The terrain there was treacherous, and the station soldiers, upon seeing the young lady, quickly went to inform Paul Levine. In a modest camp, Paul Levine met with everyone. While they were chatting, Mrs. Levine winked at Charles Justice. Confused, he saw her excuse herself and leave the room. After dinner, Paul Levine said, I am truly delighted that you all came to visit me, especially these two young men. I wish to teach you a few saber techniques. Ethan Williams eagerly agreed. Paul Levine led them to a relatively flat area, took the saber handed to him by his daughter, steadied himself, and demonstrated a series of saber techniques. Despite being over 50 years old, his body was robust, and his saber movements were seamless. The techniques were powerful and incredibly destructive. With a single strike, he split a boulder in two. Charles Justice couldn't help but secretly admire him. At that moment, the sound of wolves howling came from outside the pass. Charles Justice quickly looked toward Mrs. Loving. She nodded in acknowledgement. After finishing the saber demonstration, William Blade couldn't resist trying a few moves himself. Mrs. Loving hurriedly tossed her sword to him. Unexpectedly, William Blade didn't reach out to catch it. Just as the sword was about to fall into the ravine, he turned his palm, and the sword flew directly into his hand. Miss Loving and Charles Justice were both astonished, but Paul Levine remarked, Your swordsmanship hasn't diminished since the old days. William Blade held the sword in his hand, weighing it thoughtfully, and said, This type of sword is very suitable for young ladies. I wonder where it was forged. Paul Levine replied, I had this one specially crafted by a blacksmith in Tianshui, designed specifically for women. William Blade nodded approvingly. Excellent. I'd like to have one forged for Miss Williams as well. With that, he began to demonstrate his swordplay. William Blade's swordsmanship was incredibly swift, the blade moving so fast it left only fleeting shadows in its wake. Leaves from the cliffside trees fell like rain. Paul Levine remarked, There was once a renowned swordsmith in divine capital Luoyang, a master craftsman named Xia. Over his lifetime, he forged countless swords and was particularly skilled in crafting swords for women. Among his creations was a sword 3 feet long, its blade a vivid green that glowed faintly at night. It was called the Baishao sword. I was fortunate enough to see it once, but sadly, Master Xia has been missing for many years now. Paul Levine arranged accommodations for everyone at the camp. Mrs. Levine returned to her father's quarters, while Charles Justice gradually drifted to sleep amidst the howling mountain winds. In his dreams, he found himself beyond the borderlands, being chased by a wolf. He woke with a start, drenched in cold sweat. Opening his eyes, he noticed that the soldiers sharing the room were already starting to stir. He asked, "Why are you all up so early?" One of the soldiers replied, "We have morning exercises, young master. You can rest a bit longer." At that moment, someone slipped into the room through the door and approached Charles Justice's bed. He immediately caught a faint, pleasant fragrance. Looking up, he saw Miss Levine standing beside his bed, clad in armor. She looked down at him and said, "Get up quickly, or we'll be late." With that, she tossed a suit of armor onto his blanket, its weight pressing down uncomfortably on him. Though puzzled, Charles Justice complied. After donning the armor, he picked up his sword and asked, "Miss Levine, do I look like a soldier now?" Miss Levine motioned for him to stay quiet and gestured for him to follow her. Quickly, Charles Justice followed. The two slipped past the busy soldiers and exited the camp, where 2 war horses awaited their riders. Mrs. Levine mounted her horse immediately, prompting Charles Justice to ask in confusion, "Miss Levine, where are we going?" Mrs. Levine simply signaled for him to stop asking questions before urging her horse forward. Charles Justice hurriedly mounted his own horse and followed. The two headed toward Dajo, but unexpectedly changed direction halfway. Mrs. Levine pulled her horse to a stop and lit a small torch. She examined the mountain path closely and found 2 carved characters, ancient style. Mrs. Levine extinguished the torch and warned Charles Justice, "Stay close to me. If you fall into the ravine, I won't be able to save you." Charles Justice quickly asked, "Where exactly are we going?" Mrs. Levine replied, "You'll find out when we get there." With that, she covered her face with a thick cloth. Charles Justice quickly followed her lead, moving cautiously. The path was treacherous, flanked by steep cliffs. Fortunately, they proceeded slowly, with the mountain winds howling around them. Though it was late spring, the early morning air was still bitterly cold. After traversing the perilous cliffs, they came upon a narrow mountain path. Miss Levine dismounted and said, "We can't ride any further from here. We'll have to lead the horses carefully. You should dismount too." Charles Justice obeyed, slinging the reins over his sword. Miss Levine extended her pale, jade-like hand toward him. Charles Justice hesitated, confused. Miss Levine said, "Take my hand. The next stretch requires my guidance to get you through safely." Charles Justice, hearing this, quickly extended his left hand and felt the calluses on Miss Levine's palm, though the back of her hand was smooth as jade. His heart raced as he heard Miss Levine say, "Don't look to the side, just focus on my back." At the same time, he felt her grip on his hand tighten. As the eastern sky began to glow with the first light of dawn, the two arrived at a relatively flat hillside, overgrown with lush vegetation. Mrs. Levine released his hand and pointed eastward, saying, "The sun is about to rise. Isn't it romantic to watch the sunrise here?" Charles Justice blushed, still lingering on the warmth of Miss Levine's palm, and asked, "What does romantic mean?" Miss Levine replied, "Have you never read books? Don't you know what romance is? The words in the Book of Songs describe it as a feeling of serenity and expansiveness." The sun gradually broke free from the darkness of the east, casting radiant light across the horizon. The two stood in the early mountain breeze, gazing eastward. Charles Justice couldn't help but exclaim, "The scenery ahead is so beautiful." "What place is that?" Miss Levine replied. "That's beyond the border. Do you want to go?" Charles Justice nodded in agreement. Miss Levine added, "If you want to go beyond the border, you must do as I say." Charles Justice quickly snapped out of his daze and said, "What? We're going beyond the border? But that's Turkic territory. It'll be very dangerous, won't it?" Miss Levine removed her armor and that of her horse, saying, "Follow my instructions, and there'll be no danger." With that, she instructed Charles Justice to remove his armor, and that of his horse as well. The two carried only their swords and curved blades as they mounted their horses again. Riding forward, they reached a cliff. Across from the cliff was a flat expanse of land. Miss Levine said, "Follow me. Ride your horse across the cliff. We'll leap into the territory beyond the border." With that, she turned her horse around, creating some distance to gain momentum. Spurring her horse forward, she galloped toward the cliff. Charles Justice stared at her in fear, watching as her warhorse reached the edge, lifted its front hooves, and, with a powerful push from its hind legs, soared across the chasm and landed steadily on the other side. Seeing this, Charles Justice was both awestruck and terrified. Miss Levine turned her horse back around, waved at him, and signaled for him to do the same. Gritting his teeth and steeling his resolve, Charles Justice urged his horse forward. As he approached the cliff, the sight of the chasm ahead caused cold sweat to break out all over him. Chapter 24. Entering Turkic territory. A streak of morning cloud lifted the sun. Because it was the frontier, the scene felt even more desolate and tranquil. Charles Justice spurred his horse, attempting to mimic Miss Lu's daring leap across the cliff. However, as his horse approached the edge, he caught sight of the deep chasm below and felt a surge of fear. Yet, the warhorse leaped, tracing an arc over the ravine, landing firmly on the opposite side. It galloped forward a few steps before stopping. Miss Lu had already reined in her horse beside him. Charles Justice, who had been holding his breath, finally relaxed, only to realize his palms and forehead were drenched in sweat. Miss Lu remarked, "Judging by your reaction, you don't ride often, do you?" Charles Justice hurriedly explained, "At home, we only have a mule, so I'm used to riding that. I've borrowed horses from the village landlord before. Those horses are just slightly bigger than mules and faster too, but this massive warhorse beneath me, this is my first time riding something like this." Miss Lu said, "Stick close to me. If the Gokturk soldiers catch you, I won't be able to save you." With that, she urged her horse forward. Charles Justice quickly followed, spurring his horse to keep up. Freed from its heavy armor, the warhorse ran even faster, causing Charles Justice's heart to race with every gallop. Miss Lu turned onto a narrow path, and suddenly, a rolling landscape of hills appeared. Though undulating, the hills were not very high. Charles Justice called out loudly, "Miss Lu, where are we headed?" Miss Lu didn't answer, continuing to ride up the hill and then down into a valley. By the time the sun had risen high in the sky, the two had reached a plain. Reining in their horses, Charles Justice quickly asked again, "Where are we going?" Miss Lu raised her hand to shield her eyes from the sun and gazed into the distance. The plain wasn't vast, and at its far end lay a mountain range. A winding mountain path stretched northward. Turning back, she said, "We'll wander outside the pass for a few days first, and see if we can find that wandering old man." "Wandering old man?" Charles Justice asked in confusion. "Didn't they say it's the old man who raises wolves?" Miss Lu laughed. "That old man does nothing all day but drink tea and roam around. Isn't that the definition of wandering?" Hearing this, Charles Justice nodded and said, "So Miss Lu has met him before, and even tasted his tea? He was merely guessing, but Miss Lu nodded and replied, "That's right. Tea from beyond the frontier is quite different from Central Plains tea. Let's go!" With that, she spurred her horse onward again. The two urged their horses to gallop for a while, crossing a mountain range. After traveling a short distance, a small town appeared before them. This was a border town, a hub of trade between the Turkic people and the Han. As it was still early, only a few merchants were seen setting up their stalls. Miss Lu led him into a mutton soup shop, where a Turkic man hurriedly came to greet them, inviting the two in with fluent Han. He served them 2 large steaming bowls of mutton soup, accompanied by 2 pieces of dry bread. Charles Justice followed Miss Lu's example, breaking the bread into the hot soup. The soup, made from mutton, had a slightly gamey smell, but was still very fragrant. Miss Lu remarked, "Actually, not fighting is a good thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had the chance to enjoy this delicious meal." Charles Justice, too busy drinking the soup and eating the meat, could only nod repeatedly in agreement. After finishing their meal, Miss Lu paid for the food and bought a leather bag of wine. The two mounted their horses and left the town, continuing northward. Charles Justice, slightly uneasy, said, "If we go further north, we might encounter Turkic soldiers. Perhaps we should turn back." Miss Lu replied, "Now that we're in Turkic territory, there's a place I must visit. Just follow me." The two stopped before a stone temple, its walls inscribed with Turkic characters. Miss Lu dismounted and signaled Charles Justice to follow her inside. On the main wall of the temple stood a clay statue of a Han general, clad in armor, wearing an iron helmet, and holding a horizontal blade. His thick eyebrows and wide-open eyes gave him a commanding presence. Offerings of fruits lay before the statue, and in the incense burner on the altar, remnants of burned incense were visible. Charles Justice asked curiously, "I didn't expect the Turks to worship gods. But why would they worship a Han figure, and a general at that?" Miss Lu replied, "Bow first, and I'll explain afterward." The two knelt and bowed before the statue. Miss Lu poured wine onto the ground in front of them, then they sat on the prayer mats. Miss Lu began, "This is the statue of General Hank Tiger. General Tiger was a general of the Tang dynasty, stationed at the border between the Turks and Tang, safeguarding the peace of the Tang Empire. Unexpectedly, Queen Victoria unjustly had him killed. After General Tiger's death, the Turks lost a formidable adversary. Yet, they built this temple to honor their enemy. Before launching any campaign against the Tang, they would come here to pay homage. It's truly a rare and strange occurrence." Hearing this, Charles Justice said, "Queen Victoria didn't just kill General Tiger. She also set people to assassinate General Arthur Wing. According to what Mr. Lee from the Imperial Academy told me, Victoria has eliminated many high-ranking officials in the court." Miss Lu added, "Although I live in Dazhou, I know much about court affairs. All of this is Victoria eliminating dissent. I often worry about my father." Charles Justice, puzzled, replied, "General Lu guards the frontier. Surely nothing will happen to him. If Victoria were to kill General Lu, who would defend the border?" As he spoke, he glanced at Miss Lu and noticed her eyes glistening with tears. Just as he was wondering why, the sound of galloping hooves came from outside. Miss Lu quickly stood up and looked out, spotting a group of riders charging toward them. Miss Lu hurriedly said, "This is bad. The Turks are here. We need to hide quickly." With that, she grabbed Charles Justice's hand and leapt up, hiding behind a statue. The two of them crouched behind the deity statue, holding their breath, only to hear a group of soldiers stop in front of the temple. A deep voice sounded, speaking in the Turkic language. Charles Justice couldn't understand, but Miss Lu whispered, "Oh no, our horses." Following that, Two men began speaking loudly in Turkic inside the temple. Miss Lu still held Charles Justice's hand tightly. His heart pounded faster and faster when suddenly a loud voice spoke in Chinese. "Stop hiding, come out." Charles Justice quickly glanced at Miss Lu, who remained calm, only gripping his hand more firmly. The man in front of the statue shouted again, "I know there are two of you. If you don't come out willingly, we'll search for you." Hearing this, Miss Lu whispered to Charles Justice, "Don't be afraid, just follow my lead." Charles Justice nodded quickly in agreement. Miss Lu let go of his hand, and the two of them jumped out from behind the statue. They were immediately surrounded by a group of Turkic soldiers brandishing weapons. A robust man, around 30 years old, wearing a fur hat, waved his hand to signal the soldiers to stand down. This man, with a full beard and large eyes, spoke loudly in Chinese. "Do you know why I speak your language? Because from your horses, I can tell you're spies from the Tang dynasty. Speak. What are you here in Turkic lands to investigate?" Miss Lu glanced at the soldiers, quietly gripping her sword, calculating how to break through their encirclement. Charles Justice lowered his head, staying silent. The man continued, "Don't waste your efforts. You won't escape. If you don't speak, I'll take you back to my father for judgment." Charles Justice quickly responded, "We're not spies." The man stared at him and asked, "If you're not spies, why are you riding war horses of the Tang soldiers? If you're not spies, why did you hide when you saw us?" Charles Justice was left speechless when questioned, and Miss Levine spoke up. "We are only here to pay respects to General Hank Tiger." She then pointed at the statue of the deity. The man stared at Miss Levine intently, secretly astonished. Seeing that this woman was taller than him, dressed exceptionally, and exuded an extraordinary aura, he suspected she was no ordinary soldier. He then ordered, "Men, tie these two up and take them back to the general for judgment." Miss Levine immediately drew her long sword, shielding both of them, and declared, "Let's see who dares." The man let out a cold laugh and shouted something loudly in Turkic. He stepped back, and his soldiers, armed and ready, surrounded the two, preparing to capture them. Charles Justice hurriedly searched for his saber, only to remember he had left it on his horse's back. Regret surged through him. He had learned that a martial artist must always carry their weapon, no matter the time or place. Miss Levine noticed he was unarmed and grabbed his hand with her left, whispering, "Protect yourself and follow me as we break through." Charles Justice was about to nod when she swung her sword, parrying the blows of the Turkic soldiers closing in. The soldiers tightened their encirclement, slashing at the pair. Charles Justice dodged quickly, but suddenly felt Miss Levine release his hand. She kicked one soldier to the ground, while Charles Justice grabbed a burly man, lifted him overhead with all his strength, and hurled him into the oncoming group, knocking several soldiers down. The bearded leader, shocked by this display, instinctively drew his blade. Seizing the moment, Miss Levine grabbed Charles's hand again, slashing her way toward the temple's exit. Just as they reached the doorway, a long saber swung toward them, knocking her sword out of her grasp. Both of them were startled and looked toward the saber's wielder. It was a young, handsome officer clad in leather armor, with notably thick eyebrows. Miss Levine suddenly exclaimed, "Chu Zishan, Malatsu commander." The young officer froze in surprise. Miss Levine took advantage of his hesitation, leaping forward and kicking straight at his chest. The officer quickly raised his saber to block, but her swift, precise movements caught him off guard. He planted his feet firmly, adopting a defensive stance, but Miss Levine lightly stepped on the blade, propelling herself into the air. With a twist of her right palm, the longsword that had been knocked away earlier flew back into her grasp. Both Charles Justice and the Turkic soldiers chasing them were stunned by her astonishing martial skills. In the blink of an eye, Miss Levine flipped onto her horse. She struck down a Turkic soldier holding the reins, and used her sword to flick Charles's saber into the air, sending it flying toward him. Another Turkic soldier tried to intercept it, but the bearded man deflected the saber with his own blade. Charles Justice seized the opportunity, catching his saber midair and spinning it in a defensive arc, forcing the soldiers back. Miss Levine had already kicked another Turkic soldier aside and shouted to Charles Justice, "Get on your horse and escape!" With that, she spurred her horse toward the temple gates. Charles Justice quickly ran to his horse waiting outside, vaulted onto its back, and glanced back at Miss Levine. He saw her use her sword to disarm the young officer once again, before turning her horse to follow him. The two continued urging their horses to flee. The bearded man immediately wanted to lead the soldiers in pursuit, but was stopped by the young officer who said, "Young Master Tenant, there's no need to chase them. I want to quickly report this to the general and the eldest young master." The man named Tenant asked suspiciously, "Kevin Lane, why not pursue them? Do you know these two Han people?" The young officer, Kevin Lane, replied, "Second young master, send someone to track them. I will report this to the general." Saying this, he reached out to take the long sword that a subordinate had retrieved. Tenant then said, "There's no need to inform my father and elder brother for now. I will handle this matter." Kevin Lane responded, "Then I will lead people to follow them first. You return to gather reinforcements." Tenant agreed, mounted his horse, and rode north. Kevin Lane quickly dispatched a tall, thin soldier to track them. This slender Gokturk soldier, named Lil Mac, understood the Han language. He promptly complied and rode off in pursuit. The two galloped for over 10 miles, before pulling their reins to a halt. Seeing no pursuers behind them, they breathed a sigh of relief. Charles Justice quickly said, "That was so dangerous earlier. We should hurry back." Miss Levine, however, replied, "No rush. We still haven't found that old man." Charles Justice asked, "But where is the old man?" Miss Levine said, "I don't know where he is either. We can only head to the place where we last met him and try our luck to see if we can find him." With that, she urged her horse forward again. Charles Justice hastily followed, while behind them, Lil Mac peeked out and gazed in the direction the two were heading. Chapter 25, Episode 25, Journey with the Lady Warrior. The scenery outside was entirely different from the Central Plains, exuding a pristine and vast beauty. Unfortunately, they were in Gokturk territory, and as Han people, they dared not linger, only able to admire the flowers while riding swiftly. Passing through a weathered stone gate, a mountain range came into view. The sound of flowing water reached their ears. The two recalled the scene where they had desperately fled from the general's shrine, and were still trembling with fear. Mrs. Levine couldn't help but ask, "Earlier, your strength was incredible. How did you manage to lift a Gokturk soldier and throw him out?" Charles Justice, still shaken, replied, "I don't know either. Perhaps I was pushed to the brink by them." Two people followed the sound of water, climbing over a mountain range and turning a bend, when a dense forest suddenly appeared before their eyes. The ground was covered in a lush green carpet of young grass, and their horses instinctively lowered their heads to graze. Charles Justice couldn't help but exclaim, "The sky here is so blue, so vast." Mrs. Levine said, "This is the difference between the borderlands and the interior. I truly love the vastness and freedom here, but since this is the border of the Turks, I dare not be too conspicuous. Every time I come, I sneak in and avoid their soldiers whenever I see them." The two continued through the dense forest, and a wide river immediately came into view. Perhaps due to the terrain, the water flowed rapidly, churning up white foam. By the river, an old man wearing a conical hat was fishing. Next to him, there was no fish basket, only a stone table with a steaming cup of tea on top. Upon seeing the old man, Mrs. Levine exclaimed joyfully, "We found him! I'm certain it's him!" She pointed to a small fire near the trees, where a pot of water was still being heated. Hearing this, Charles Justice was also overjoyed and eager to meet the person Miss Levine had mentioned. Together, they rode toward the river. Upon reaching it, they reined in their horses and dismounted. The old man remained with his back to them. Mrs. Levine clasped her hands and said, "Elder, I've come to seek you once again." Meanwhile, Lil Mac, who was hiding in the forest, nodded and muttered, "So they came to find this old man." With that, he turned his horse back the way he came. As he exited the forest, he suddenly saw a massive gray wolf staring at him. Its piercing green eyes sent a chill down his spine. Gripping the saber at his waist tightly, he watched as the wolf bared its teeth, causing his horse to rear in fright. Lil Mac quickly spurred his horse into a gallop, and fortunately, the wolf did not pursue him. By the river, the old man heard the voice, turned around, and removed his conical hat. Charles Justice exclaimed in astonishment, "So it's you!" The old man smiled at the two of them and said, "Miss Levine has snuck out to play again, hasn't she?" Mrs. Levine nodded and sat cross-legged in front of him, motioning for Charles Justice to do the same. The old man took out 2 cups and poured them tea. Charles Justice, filled with excitement, said, "Aren't you the elder who saved the messenger in the Capitol?" The old man nodded and replied, "Yes, that was me." "And where is the young lady you saved from being trampled by horses?" Mrs. Levine was also surprised and said, "What? You two know each other? I was planning to introduce you to one another. It seems I was overthinking." The old man said, "I am Lucas Sage, living alone at the border. Having both of you visit is an honor. Miss Levine is so enthusiastic. How could that be overthinking?" Mrs. Levine said, "Earlier, we were discovered by Turkic soldiers at the general's temple, and even fought with them. Luckily, we risked our lives to escape." Charles Justice quickly nodded and said, "That's right. Among them, there was a young man wielding a blade with exceptional martial skills. He even disarmed Miss Levine's sword." Lucas Sage nodded and said, "The Turkic lands are vast and full of hidden talents. It's not unusual for a few skilled fighters to appear. However, the two of you have already been targeted by General Tualu Nahi's subordinates. The general's eldest son has admired you for a long time, Miss Levine. I suspect they will soon send troops to invite you." Both of them were shocked upon hearing this. Charles Justice asked skeptically, "Senior, how do you know this so clearly? Could it be that you are acquainted with them?" Lucas Sage nodded and said, "I often stay here, so naturally, I know them well." Mrs. Levine said, "Doesn't that mean I'm in great danger? Senior, can we move somewhere else to talk?" Charles Justice added, "Exactly. If that young man brings troops to capture us, it will be hard to deal with." Master Lucas Sage said, "No need. Their detective will run back to report and then run back here, which will take some time. Seeing you two have traveled so far, you must be hungry." The two quickly nodded. Master Lucas Sage continued, "There's nothing fancy here to treat you, but luckily there's fresh fish and wild chicken that we can grill." Charles Justice looked at him, puzzled, and asked, "But you don't have any fish with you? Do you mean you're going to catch some now?" Master Lucas Sage nodded and said, "Fresh fish must be caught right away." With that, he picked up his fishing rod, holding it between 2 fingers. Charles Justice looked closely and noticed the hook was just a straight, gold-plated steel needle with no bait. He couldn't help but laugh and said, "Senior, can you really catch fish with this hook?" Mrs. Levine interjected, "Senior isn't fishing. He's using the needle to shoot the fish." Master Lucas Sage nodded in agreement. He fixed his gaze on the river, locking onto a carp hiding beneath the water. With a flick of his 2 fingers, the golden needle shot out, piercing into the river. Soon, the fishing line tightened as the water pulled against it. Lucas Sage reeled in the line, pulling up a carp over a meter long, struggling in his grip. Charles Justice, both astonished and delighted, quickly stepped forward to help with the fish. Master Lucas Sage said, "You're at the age where you eat a lot, so I'll grill this fish for you. First, you need to gut it and clean out the insides. Be careful not to lose anything." Charles Justice eagerly agreed, taking out the small dagger gifted to him by William Blade. By the riverside, he began to prepare the fish. Master Lucas Sage asked, "Was it Minister Blade, William Blade, who brought you to Yinden Pass?" While cleaning the fish, Charles Justice replied, "Senior, you truly have divine insight. I've already become a disciple of Minister Blade." Master Lucas Sage stood up, packed away the fishing rod, and said, "It seems he knows he's getting old and needs a successor. You stay here and finish preparing the fish. I'll take Miss Loving to hunt for wild chicken." Charles Justice agreed, while Mrs. Loving added, "Once you're done with the fish, go ahead and start grilling it at the campfire. No need to wait for us." Charles Justice, focused on cleaning the fish, nodded without looking up. As Mrs. Loving followed Master Lucas Sage into the forest, a large gray wolf suddenly emerged from the woods. Startled, Mrs. Loving quickly stepped back, but soon regained her composure. Master Lucas Sage reached out to pet the wolf's head and said, "Miss Loving, haven't you met it before?" Mrs. Loving nodded and said, "It appeared so suddenly, I wasn't prepared." Master Lucas Sage said to the gray wolf, "From now on, don't act so recklessly." The gray wolf seemed to understand his words and licked his palm. Master Lucas Sage continued, "Go catch a wild pheasant and bring it here as an apology to Miss Loving." The gray wolf quickly turned and dashed into the forest. The 2 of them paused by the campfire. While tending to the flames, Master Lucas Sage asked, "Is your father in good health?" Miss Loving nodded and replied, "Charles Justice was brought here by Senior William Blade from the capital. Along with them came Deputy Commander Ethan Williams of General Arthur Wing's forces and his family. They are being pursued by Robert Rising, a villain of the court. I'm worried that my father might face the same fate." Master Lucas Sage added more wood to the fire and said, "Queen Victoria placed the 4-colored petition box at the palace gates, leading to a surge in secret reports. She is using the hands of villains to eliminate the old ministers of the previous dynasty and the generals of the Lee family. Your father, along with Hank Tiger and Arthur Wing, has been stationed at the border for years, fighting against the Turks. Only because your father's reputation isn't as prominent as the other 2 has Queen Victoria spared him so far. However, he may not escape this fate forever. It is the destiny of all beings." Miss Loving's face showed a mixture of shock and worry as she asked, "What should I do? I've always feared that Victoria would send someone to execute my father. I don't want to lose him." Master Lucas Sage replied, "General Loving might survive this ordeal, but there will undoubtedly be sacrifices and losses." At that moment, Charles Justice returned after cleaning the fish and announced, "I've cleaned the fish. We can grill it now. But where is your pheasant?" Suddenly, the gray wolf emerged from the forest, startling Charles Justice so much that he fell to the ground, nearly dropping the fish in his hands. Miss Loving's sorrow turned into a bright smile as she exclaimed, "Look, my prey has arrived." The gray wolf dropped the pheasant on the ground. Master Lucas Sage patted its head and pointed toward the riverbank. The gray wolf immediately ran to the river, spotted the fish entrails by the shore, and devoured them in one gulp. Master Lucas Sage placed the iron pot down. Mrs. Loving extended her hand to help Charles Justice stand up, then began plucking the wild pheasant using boiling water. Master Lucas Sage said. I might have startled you. This is an old friend of mine named Jillian. What is your name? Blushing, Charles Justice skewered a fish with a branch, placed it over the fire to roast, and replied, Junior Charles Justice, from Handan, Hebei. But didn't you already know my name, Senior? Master Lucas Sage continued. Yin and Zhao have many talented individuals. If you promise to do something, you must fulfill it without fail. Never forget that. Charles Justice suddenly recalled his vow to keep secret what he had witnessed that night. He nodded in agreement and then asked, What would you like to eat, Senior? Blue Forest replied, I've been a vegetarian for many years. I only eat this now. With that, he pulled out a paper package from his robe, revealing cheese and milk cakes. Mrs. Loving quickly finished preparing the pheasant and placed it over the fire to roast. Before long, the aroma filled the air. As he sipped his tea, the master said, If you're ever alone in the wilderness, never do this. The smell of food will attract wild beasts, and you'll be in danger. Mrs. Loving nodded in acknowledgement, while Charles Justice asked, Then how should we cook without attracting wild animals, Senior? Master Blue Forest explained, Wrap the wild meat in clay, bury it in the fire to cook, and then climb a tree to eat it quickly. He turned to Mrs. Loving and said, Nature operates on this principle. The strong prey on the weak. The world is no different. Only the fittest survive. Charles Justice said, But now, in the capital, corrupt officials and scoundrels run rampant. What should I do if I don't want to collude with them? Master Blue Forest replied, Then follow your master. Leave the capital and travel the world. As night fell, the group shared food with one another, and Charles Justice felt a warmth in his heart. Master Blue Forest brewed tea and offered it to the two of them. Taking a sip, Charles Justice noticed that it was bitter at first, but turned sweet upon swallowing. Curious, he asked, Senior, what kind of tea is this? Why is it bitter first, and then sweet? Master Blue Forest said, This is medicinal tea I brought back from a distant place. Drinking it regularly strengthens the body. Soon, you'll notice the herbal fragrance. As expected, not long after, he felt a faint herbal aroma emanating from his stomach. After finishing the meal, Charles Justice looked at Master Blue Forest and asked, Senior, where will you sleep tonight? I haven't seen any houses nearby. Master Blue Forest replied, I'm used to wandering here and there, no longer accustomed to sleeping indoors. I'll sleep over there. He stood up and pointed to a large tree. Its branches were lush and thick, but there seemed to be no place suitable for sleeping. Master Blue Forest extinguished the campfire and led them into the forest, stopping under the large tree. With a light leap, he jumped up into the tree and disappeared into the foliage. As Charles Justice stood surprised, a mat and an animal hide fell from the tree, followed by Master Blue Forest's deep voice. Miss Loving, use the method I taught you earlier to guide this friend in how to sleep. Mrs. Loving nodded, spread out the mat and the hide, then sat down and gestured for Charles Justice to sit beside her. Seeing this, Charles Justice felt a bit flustered and quickly said, No need, the mat is so small. Miss Loving, you should rest. I'll stand guard and ensure your safety. Mrs. Loving, touched by his words, replied, No need. It's very safe here. Sit down, and I'll teach you the method of meditation. She crossed her legs, placed her hands on her chest, took a deep breath, and then slowly placed her hands on her knees. Charles Justice quickly followed suit, closing his eyes. He felt both excited and nervous, as it was the first time he had been alone with a woman in the wilderness. Suddenly, the howl of a wolf startled him, causing him to open his eyes and grip the blade beside him tightly. Chapter 26. The 26th episode, A Wild Night. In the desolate mountains and wilderness near the frontier, The cool mountain breeze blew gently. Hearing the howl of wolves at night was not unusual. Charles Justice sat cross-legged on the animal hide next to Miss Levine, just beginning to regulate his breathing. Suddenly, a mournful wolf's howl echoed, prompting both of them to open their eyes. From the tree above, Master Blue Forest spoke. "Stay here and don't move. I'll go see what's happening." The branches swayed, and a large bird flew out from the tree, heading toward the source of the wolf's howl. Charles Justice felt both astonished and thrilled. This was the first time he had spent a night outdoors with a woman. He glanced toward Miss Levine, but in the darkness, he could only see her sitting still. He quickly asked, "Miss Levine, aren't you afraid?" Mrs. Levine calmly replied, "In this desolate and foreign land, during the dark of night, I am a bit scared. But I can overcome it. What about you? Are you very afraid?" Charles Justice nodded and answered, "If you're not afraid, then neither am I." Yet, deep inside, he still felt tense. Mrs. Levine then said to him, "A true man must be fearless. Right now, don't think about anything. Just follow the senior's instructions, slow your breathing, and let your body and mind relax." Charles Justice followed her instructions. Shortly after, the giant bird returned, landing in front of the two. Suddenly, a spark of light flashed, and Master Lucas Sage appeared before them. He lit a campfire as Mrs. Levine opened her eyes and asked, "Elder, what just happened? Why did Jillian cry out?" Charles Justice, deep in thought and undistracted, neither heard her voice nor noticed Master Lucas Sage, cloaked in black, as he tended the fire and softly said, "Perhaps it saw someone and gave a warning. It seems those chasing you are nearing." Upon hearing this, Mrs. Levine asked, "What should we do? Should we leave now?" Master Lucas Sage replied, "No need to worry. From the General's temple to here is a day's journey. Even if they catch up with me here, they wouldn't dare act recklessly. Rest assured and sleep here." Mrs. Levine agreed, and Master Lucas Sage leapt into a tree, resembling a great black bird. The next morning, Charles Justice woke to find his clothing soaked in sweat. He noticed Miss Levine, at some point during the night, had fallen asleep on the ground, using his broad stomach as a pillow. She was sound asleep. Her eyes were closed, her brows delicately shaped like a painting, her small nose breathing softly with minimal sound. Her rosy lips looked full and vibrant, complementing her flushed cheeks. Watching her peaceful slumber, Charles Justice couldn't help but feel a wave of compassion. Noticing her wearing plain clothes, he worried she might be cold. Gently, he removed his coarse jacket, intending to cover her, but his hand trembled when he caught sight of a patch of white skin at her delicate neckline. Mrs. Levine immediately opened her eyes, frowned, and said, "Why does it smell so sweaty? It's awful. Take it away." Charles Justice quickly withdrew his jacket. As she lifted her head from his stomach, she said, "Sorry for using your stomach as a pillow. Your clothes smell too sweaty. Go to the river and wash them." Charles Justice agreed, stood up, and stretched. After a night's rest, he felt his strength return. By now, dawn had broken, and the campfire beside them had burned down to glowing embers. Miss Levine also got up, tidied her clothes, and added dry wood to the coals. Following the sound of water, Charles Justice reached the riverbank. First, he washed his face with the river water, then removed his undershirt and jacket, scrubbing them clean in the flowing stream. Dawn was breaking as Mrs. Levine arrived at the riverbank. She walked toward Charles Justice, who was upstream, crouched down, removed her hairpin, and let her long, silky black hair cascade down. She leaned forward and used the river water to wash her face. Meanwhile, Charles Justice hurriedly wrung out his undershirt, put it on, and continued washing his coat. After washing her face, Mrs. Levine began combing her hair and remarked, You've just started practicing the great breathing technique, so you sweat a lot. In time, when you're deep in sleep, the sweating will lessen. Charles Justice watched her washing her hair in the river, mesmerized by her graceful demeanor, so much so that he didn't even notice his coat being swept away by the current. Mrs. Loving lifted her head, saw him staring blankly at her, and said, "Keep staring, and your coat will be carried away by the river, never to return." Snapping back to reality, Charles Justice quickly looked for his coat, only to find it had already been swept to the middle of the stream. He immediately jumped into the river, swimming toward it. However, the river, which appeared calm on the surface, concealed a strong undercurrent beneath. Just as he was about to grab the coat, Charles Justice realized he had lost control of his movements. The swift current threatened to drag both him and the coat away. Panicked, he tried to cry out for help, but as soon as he opened his mouth, a mouthful of water rushed in, filling his lungs. Flailing his arms in desperation, he found nothing to hold on to. Seeing him sinking and thrashing in the river, Mrs. Loving quickly understood he was drowning. Without hesitation, she dove into the river, swam toward him, and grabbed his hand. In his panic, Charles Justice clung tightly to her waist, inadvertently immobilizing her as well, forcing her to struggle against the current. At that moment, a large gray wolf leapt from the forest into the river and swam toward them. Mrs. Loving, relieved at the sight, immediately struck Charles Justice unconscious with a palm strike. She grabbed the wolf's tail with one hand while paddling with the other. The large gray wolf bit down on Charles Justice's arm and swam toward the shore, pulling both of them to safety. Master Lucas Sage arrived just in time. Seeing the situation, he grabbed the unconscious Charles Justice, turned him face down over his knee, and pressed on his back to expel the water. Mrs. Loving released the wolf's tail, gasping for breath. The large gray wolf turned and ran back toward the river. Charles Justice coughed up several mouthfuls of water, regaining consciousness to find himself lying on Master Lucas Sage's knee. He felt a warm energy being channeled into his body as the master pressed his palm against his back. A gentle morning breeze blew by, and Mrs. Loving, feeling a sudden chill, hurried to the fire. She added dry wood to the flames, removed her outer garment to wring out the water, and placed it near the fire to dry. Seeing Charles Justice had vomited all the water he had swallowed, Master Lucas Sage set him down and asked, "Why did you jump into the river?" Charles Justice quickly replied, "I was sweating a lot, so I went to the riverbank to wash my clothes. Unexpectedly, the current swept my shirt away, so I jumped in to retrieve it." At that moment, Jillian emerged from the river, holding Charles's clothing in her mouth. Master Lucas Sage remarked, "This river may look calm on the surface, but beneath it, there are strong undercurrents, much like the world itself." Charles Justice said, "There's a river in my hometown, and I often bathe in it, but it's nothing like this one. The current here is so strong." He wrung out his outer shirt as he spoke. Suddenly, he sneezed, prompting Master Lucas Sage to say, "Quickly, go near the fire to warm yourself. You'll catch a cold otherwise." By now, the morning light had fully broken, and the sun had risen in the east. Charles Justice grabbed his shirt and approached the fire, where Miss Loving was sitting, focused on drying her clothes. Her soaked inner garment clung to her slender back, revealing her smooth, bare skin. Charles Justice blushed involuntarily as he stepped closer, placing his outer shirt by the fire to dry. Noticing his approach, Miss Loving quickly put on her outer garment and said, "You can't even swim, yet you dared to jump into the river to fetch your clothes." Charles Justice replied, "I can swim, but I didn't expect the river's current to be so strong. Thank you for saving me. I didn't know you could swim as well." After putting on her shirt, Miss Loving resumed combing her long hair and said, "There's a river in my hometown too. In the summer, my nanny wouldn't let me swim, so I'd sneak out at night to practice. I taught myself how to swim. No one ever instructed me. Charles Justice couldn't help but admire her and asked, "What about your mother? Didn't she know?" Miss Levine replied, "My father spent years guarding the border. My mother was ambushed and killed by enemy soldiers during a trip to visit him, and I was captured. My father and Senior William Blade stormed the enemy camp to rescue me. I was terrified back then, but the two of them fought like madmen, slaughtering all the enemy soldiers. Their clothes were stained red with blood. Since then, I've always stayed by my father's side. Later, when he was stationed at J Gate Pass, I was old enough to stay behind in our home at Daijo." Hearing her story, Charles Justice sighed and said, "Miss Levine, losing your mother at such a young age must have been very lonely." Mrs. Levine replied, "No, I have many friends, but as soon as father returns home, he doesn't allow me to go out. Being alone and sorrowful at home is what true loneliness feels like." Charles Justice seized the opportunity to ask, "With such impressive martial arts skills, miss, it must be your father who taught you, right?" Mrs. Levine said, "Not entirely. Father's friends are all proficient in martial arts. Whenever they visit, they teach me their techniques." At that moment, Master Lucas Sage approached, carrying 2 wild rabbits in his hand, and said, "Earlier, Jillian caught these 2 wild rabbits for you. Prepare and roast them to enjoy." Charles Justice quickly took them and went to the riverbank to handle the rabbits. Mrs. Levine playfully teased him, "This time, be careful, all right? Don't fall into the river again." Master Lucas Sage leaped onto a tree and said, "Miss Levine, come up here. I have something to discuss with you." Mrs. Levine pinned her hair with a hairpin and gracefully jumped onto the large tree. She saw a simple wooden house built from branches and planks nestled in the tree. Grasping a branch, she stepped inside and noticed the interior was arranged with various living essentials. Master Lucas Sage invited her to sit on a long bench made from branches and said, "Now, let's talk about your father." Once Mrs. Levine descended, she felt uneasy. Master Lucas Sage said, "Although I don't live in the capital, I am aware of the situation there. 2 renowned generals who defended the borders were executed by Queen Victoria. Your father, whose reputation doesn't measure up to theirs, has now found himself in such a predicament. Based on Queen Victoria's tendencies and her predatory nephews, it's certain that your father will not escape this calamity." Hearing this, Mrs. Levine's eyes revealed sorrow. Worried, she said, "I feel the same. General Wing's deputy, Ethan Williams, and his entire family were implicated, only to be saved by Senior William Blade and brought to Dai Prefecture to seek refuge with my father. Master, what can I do to help my father avoid this disaster?" Master Lucas Sage replied, "With your father's temperament, I fear he won't accept the methods I propose." Mrs. Levine asked in confusion, "Why is that? Aren't you a close confidant of my father? Could it be that he doesn't even heed your advice?" Master Lucas Sage replied, "Most generals are like that. They would rather die than yield. Little do they realize that the ability to adapt is what makes a true man of greatness." Mrs. Levine suggested, "Master, why don't you come with me to meet my father? With Uncle William Blade also present, I think my father might not be so stubborn." Master Lucas Sage said, "General Levine is currently stationed at Yunnan Pass. It's not convenient for me to visit him now. If the opportunity arises, I will try to persuade him." Mrs. Levine thanked him. Master Lucas Sage then remarked, "That young man must have finished roasting the hare by now. The aroma has already reached here. It's a pity I'm vegetarian, otherwise I wouldn't be able to resist drooling." The 2 of them leapt down from the tree and approached the campfire. Seeing them arrive, Charles Justice was delighted and quickly divided the roasted hare for them to eat. Master Lucas Sage, however, took out some flatbread and cheese, saying, "I only eat these now, no meat for me." Mrs. Levine took the roasted hare, brought it to her nose, and said, Perfectly cooked, not burnt. Crispy on the outside, tender on the inside. It smells delicious." Master Lucas Sage commented, "Young people enjoy their food and have strong stomachs. My stomach isn't as good anymore, so I must stick to a vegetarian diet for health." As the three of them sat around the fire eating, Jillian suddenly howled. Master Lucas Sage paid no attention, continuing to drink his milk, and said, "They've arrived." Mrs. Levine grew a bit tense upon hearing this, while Charles Justice asked in confusion, "Could it be those eunuch soldiers chasing us? Should we run?" Master Lucas Sage replied, "No need. In life, there are some people you are destined to face. Running away is futile." At that moment, the sound of galloping hooves grew louder, and a horse raced swiftly toward them. ### Chapter 27 A Special Reunion. When calamity strikes, people instinctively think of escaping, as calamity often brings death. However, as long as one survives, blessings may follow. As the sages say, misfortune and fortune are interdependent. Charles Justice thought it was the doctored soldiers pursuing them, but to his surprise, it was the young officer from yesterday who dismounted his horse. Startled, Charles quickly gripped his blade tightly, positioning himself in front of Miss Levine to shield her. The young officer merely glanced at them before clasping his hands in salute toward Master Lucas Sage, saying, "Junior Sami Zayn pays respects to the elder. My family's ancestor, General Liu, invites you to the mansion for a discussion." Both Charles Justice and Miss Levine were somewhat astonished. Master Lucas Sage, however, replied, "What does he want with this old man? Can't he see I have two friends visiting me?" The young officer, whose Han name was Sami Zayn, had frequently interacted with the Han people. He had taken on a Han name, which, in fact, was given to him by Master Lucas Sage as a symbol of cultural exchange and integration between the Gokturks and the Han. Sammy leaned in and whispered something to Master Lucas Sage, whose expression immediately changed. He said, "In that case, I'll first escort my two friends away, then head to General Liu's mansion." Sami Zayn responded, "The elder can bring them along to the general's mansion. After all, we are not strangers to one another." Master Lucas Sage replied, "Miss Levine may come to the mansion, but not in this manner." Hearing this, Sami Zayn's face turned pale. He said, "There are some matters beyond my control. I fear none of us can avoid them. But I swear, we will not harm you in any way." Master Lucas Sage said, "You can only vouch for your own actions, but you cannot guarantee that others won't harm us. It's better to have all your companions come out now." Reluctantly, Sami Zayn pulled out a ram's horn trumpet from his side and blew it loudly. Instantly, a group of horsemen emerged from behind the woods. Leading them was a tall and robust young man with thick eyebrows, large eyes, a high nose, and full lips. He wore a white turban adorned with a ruby. This man ordered the soldiers behind him to stay within the woods. Dismounting his horse, he approached. He wore a silk robe with a fur cloak over it, and stood as tall as a horse's neck. Charles Justice thought to himself, "How could someone be so tall? He's even taller than General Levine. And wearing such thick clothing, could he be afraid of the cold?" The burly man stepped forward, clasped his hands, and said, "Junior Lil Mac pays respects to Elder Lucas Sage. Has Sami Zayn not explained the purpose of our visit to you?" Master Lucas Sage replied, "If you hadn't shown up, wouldn't I have disappointed you by escorting my two friends away?" Everyone's gaze shifted between this man and Miss Levine, their expressions filled with surprise. Miss Levine was equally astonished upon seeing him and murmured, "It's him. This is bad." She immediately reached for the sword at her side. Charles Justice, thinking a fight was imminent, gripped his blade tightly and whispered to Miss Levine, "I'll cover you. Get on the horse and ride away." Lil Mac said, "Elder, are you still well acquainted here?" Grandmaster Lucas Sage said, "I have been here for over a year now, so there's nothing unfamiliar to me. It's just that having you travel such a long way to visit me, I keep wondering whether I should let you meet Miss Levine or not." Lil Mac said, "The kindness and goodwill of the senior towards me I will never forget for the rest of my life." He struggled to say this idiom, clearly showing his unfamiliarity with the Chinese language. Sami Zayn said, "The young general only wishes to invite you to the manor as guests." Master Lucas Sage replied, "They are friends of mine. They have no intention of visiting the general's manor right now. I fear going there uninvited might lead to unnecessary misunderstandings." Lil Mac said, "Don't you people have a saying in Chinese, when friends come from afar, invite them home and treat them warmly?" Charles Justice nearly burst into laughter upon hearing this, and Master Lucas Sage merely shook his head and corrected him. "It seems you haven't studied thoroughly. The correct phrase is it not delightful to have friends come from afar?" Lil Mac responded, "That may be how you Chinese people say it, but for us Turks, when friends come from afar, we always invite them home and treat them generously." Master Lucas Sage shook his head. "The time isn't right yet. I will introduce you to each other. Perhaps you've already met." Charles Justice felt completely lost, as if he were in a fog, and glanced at Miss Levine, who also looked puzzled. Master Lucas Sage said, "This young lady is the daughter of General Paul Levine, who guards Dojo of the Tang Dynasty. Beside her is her friend, Charles Justice." Lil Mac and Sami Zayn both turned their gazes toward the two. Master Lucas Sage then introduced them in return. Lil Mac is the eldest son of Tulu Nahak, the southern general of the Turks. His Turkic name is Tulu Sudo, but he adopted the name Lil Mac in the Chinese fashion. Sami Zayn is both his friend and deputy. Lil Mac clasped his hands in greeting to the two. "Miss Levine, we meet again. I've realized we are not enemies right now, so there's no need for you to feel tense." Miss Levine replied, "Not being enemies now doesn't mean we won't be enemies in the future." Lil Mac pointed at Charles Justice and said, "Your lieutenant is also here. Although we are in the territory of the Turks, I am a scholar of Han literature and understand its principles." Charles Justice immediately retorted, "I am Miss Levine's friend, not her lieutenant. You may have read many Han books, but you fail to grasp their meaning." Lil Mac ignored him and continued speaking to Miss Levine. "As long as you are willing, and they are willing, you, and they will never become enemies, forever good friends." Charles Justice, hearing his every word emphasized, couldn't help but say, "Even your speech is unclear. What are you so proud of?" Sami Zayn interjected, "My young master is sincere." Master Lucas Sage added, "It's evident. We can all understand it. But if this matter is reported to Mado Khan of the Turks, what do you think the consequences will be?" Both men were stunned upon hearing this. Master Lucas Sage continued, "Therefore, this matter must be discussed carefully. For now, I can only introduce you to each other, and it's imperative to quickly send the two of them back. Otherwise, with so many people talking, this will undoubtedly draw attention." Lil Mac sighed deeply and said, "Sami Zayn, can't you just pretend you didn't see them and let them enjoy their time here in peace?" Sami Zayn, with a wrong expression, replied, "It wasn't me who angered them. It was the second young master and Kevin Lane who did." Master Lucas Sage said, "Now that you've met, you can leave. If fate allows, you will surely meet again someday." Lil Mac asked reluctantly, "Is Miss Levine returning to the Tang Dynasty soon?" Miss Levine said nothing, but Master Lucas Sage replied, "General Zulu has mobilized so many people. It's likely that your father and everyone in the household are already aware of this matter. Given Miss Levine's unique status, it's inconvenient for her to stay here. Naturally, she must return. Miss Levine softly said, "What a pity. I haven't had enough fun yet. Every time I come to the border, I never get to fully enjoy myself." Sami Zayn teased. If Miss Levine were to marry into the Turks, she could come here and play to her heart's content in the future. This sentence could have simply been a joke. Mrs. Levine didn't take it seriously, but Charles Justice felt somewhat displeased after hearing it. However, even more upset than him was Lil Mac, who seemed visibly angry. His face darkened as he shouted something in Uyghur at Sami Zayn. Apart from Charles Justice, the expressions of the other three people turned unusual. Mrs. Levine looked at Sami Zayn with a puzzled face, then turned to Lil Mac. Lil Mac, looking alarmed, cast a pleading glance at Master Lucas Sage. Master Lucas Sage said something in Uyghur to Lil Mac, and the two of them immediately mounted their horses and departed. The army in the forest followed suit and retreated. Charles Justice, confused, asked, "What just happened? What were you all talking about?" Mrs. Levine seemed to have realized something, gazed at the departing figures, then turned back again. Charles Justice remarked, "Sami Zayn merely made a joke, but Lil Mac seemed really angry." The old monk, Lucas Sage, said, "When someone has truly fallen for another, even a grain of sand becomes unbearable in their eyes." Mrs. Levine suddenly understood and commented, "So, falling deeply in love can be terrifying." The old monk, Lucas Sage, replied, "In the 4 precepts of Buddhism, there is one against infatuation. I shall bring you all back to the Great Tang." Charles Justice continued to ask, "What did that Lil Mac guy just say? Why did he scare that Zayn guy so badly that his face turned pale?" Mrs. Levine, while packing her belongings onto her horse, replied, "Lil Mac asked Sami Zayn if he wanted to marry this young lady and warned him not to speak nonsense." Charles Justice quickly gathered his belongings, grabbed his sword, mounted his horse, and noticed that Mrs. Levine had already urged her horse in the direction they had come from. Charles Justice hurriedly bid farewell to the old monk Lucas Sage and spurred his horse to catch up. The two rode their horses through forests and mountains, crossing a mountain range until they reached the entrance of towards civilized mountain. Behind them, the old monk Lucas Sage had climbed to a hillside, watching the two as they departed. At that moment, the sound of horse hooves approached, stopping beside him. Earth Tree, accompanied by Kevin Lane, arrived. Kevin Lane bore a slight resemblance to Sami Zayn. Both dismounted their horses, and respectfully saluted the old monk Lucas Sage. Earth Tree spoke, "Senior, I heard my father mention to others that Khan Imode is mobilizing a large army for him, seemingly to wage war against the Tang dynasty." The old monk Lucas Sage questioned, "The Turkic Khaganate waging war against the Tang dynasty. This is a military secret. How do you know about it? Even if you do, why are you telling me?" Earth Tree was startled and quickly explained, "Although we are generals, we do not want to fight. War is too dangerous. We could lose our lives or be injured. Therefore, I wish to invite you, Senior, to persuade my father not to go to war with the Tang dynasty." Kevin Lane added, "That's right. Paul Levine is currently stationed at Yan'an Pass. Even though we have more soldiers, I fear we are no match for him. If the Tang army counterattacks, it might even implicate you, Senior." The old monk Lucas Sage, half believing, asked, "Is this true?" Both immediately replied in unison, "We dare not deceive you, Senior." Earth Tree pleaded, "For the sake of sparing the people of both nations from the horrors of war, I humbly ask you, Senior, to endure some hardship and accompany me back to persuade my father." The old monk Lucas Sage nodded in agreement, saying, "All right, but I cannot guarantee that I will be able to convince your father." Earth Tree was overjoyed to hear this, and quickly invited him onto his mount, then turned to Kevin Lane and said, "I will ride your horse back with Senior Lucas Sage. You can walk back slowly." Kevin Lane agreed, and the two exchanged glances. After they rode off into the distance, Kevin Lane clapped his hands. Suddenly, several horsemen emerged from the hillside. Judging by their attire, they were Turkic cavalry. One of them stepped forward and saluted, saying, "Subordinate greets Captain." He then led over a fine steed. Kevin Lane mounted it and asked, "What's the situation over there?" The horseman replied, "Rest assured, Captain. I have set up an ambush as per General Earth Tree's instructions. All weapons are blunt, ensuring that neither of them will be harmed." Kevin Lane warned, "Stop talking nonsense. Miss Lovine's martial skills are not weak, and her deputy's skills are also formidable. Do not underestimate them." With that, he spurred his horse forward, and the remaining horsemen quickly followed. It turned out that Kevin Lane had reported this matter to Lil Mac, the eldest son of General Tulu. The man who had been tailing them earlier was also one of Lil Mac's men. Lil Mac waited for Miss Lavine to arrive before leading his guards to meet her. After the eldest son returned empty-handed, Earth Tree and Kevin Lane devised a plan to lure the old monk Lucas Sage away, allowing Kevin Lane to lead men to ambush Mrs. Lavine and Charles Justice. Their intention was either to capture them alive, either to claim them as their own, or to use them to gain favor with General Tulu. Mrs. Lavine and Charles Justice, both riding horses, had just passed through the mountain gate when they suddenly heard loud shouts. Before them, a large group of robust Gokturk men appeared, all wielding ropes and wooden clubs as weapons, looking very much like bandits. Suddenly, a rope was stretched across the path, blocking the way in front of their horses. Both mounts stumbled simultaneously. Miss Lavine immediately leaped into the air, drawing the long sword from her waist, while Charles Justice fell to the ground, his face covered in dust. Despite the pain, he managed to roll over, grab the saber strap to his horse, and stand up. The Gokturk men spurred their horses forward, surrounding the two as they shouted loudly. Several of them swung their lassos, preparing to capture the pair. Mrs. Lavine swiftly sliced through the rope that had tripped the horses, allowing the steeds to rise again. Suddenly, a horn sounded, and multiple lassos were thrown at once. Mrs. Lavine quickly warned, "Watch out for the lassos. Don't let them tie us up." Both of them swung their weapons to fend off the ropes. However, two lassos targeted their mounts, tightening around the horses' necks and dragging them away. Within moments, the two lost their cover and had no choice but to remain vigilant. Mrs. Lavine instructed, "Guard my back. Don't let them attack us from behind. We'll stand back to back." Charles Justice quickly complied. Mrs. Lavine, suspicious, muttered, "Why hasn't Master Lucas Sage arrived yet?" Chapter 28. Mrs. Lavine is captured. Far from home, and surrounded by enemies, Miss Lavine was determined to fight to the death. Her status left no room for her to fall into enemy hands. Observing that the attackers carried no sharp weapons, it seemed they intended to capture them alive. Charles Justice saw more enemies closing in. Although they refrained from attacking with swords or knives, several riders persistently swung their lassos. Mrs. Lavine immediately slashed one of the ropes aimed at her. She sought to avoid killing, but Charles Justice did not share her restraint. As a rider galloped past him, Charles began to adapt from his initial panic. His eyes locked onto the target, waiting for the right moment. The instant a rider charged toward him, he swung his saber with both hands. The rider failed to dodge in time, and the saber severed the front legs of the horse. The animal let out a piercing neigh, blood spraying everywhere as it collapsed to the ground. The rider tumbled off, but quickly rolled aside to avoid further harm. At that moment, Kevin Lane rode up, witnessing the scene. He immediately ordered the riders to cast their lassos at the pair. Seeing this, Charles Justice shouted angrily, "Well done, Jujishin! You dare betray us!" Consumed by rage, he plunged his saber into the belly of the injured horse, let out a loud roar, and with all his strength, lifted the nearly 500-pound animal. He hurled it toward the group of riders. Everyone was astonished, unable to believe that someone so young could possess such immense strength. Mrs. Loving was equally stunned and quickly ensnared by a lasso. Charles Justice immediately swung his broadsword to rescue her, but a horse galloped over, its rider brandishing a long sword that intercepted his attack. In an instant, several more lassos bound Mrs. Loving tightly, rendering her immobile and filling her heart with unease. Seeing this, Charles Justice grew even more anxious. He swung his broadsword again, recklessly charging at Kevin Lane, pressing forward step by step. Kevin Lane quickly raised his long sword to block the strikes. The clash of weapons echoed continuously as Charles's relentless attack sent shockwaves through Kevin's arms, leaving his hands numb. The ferocity of Charles's assault intimidated Kevin's knights, preventing them from intervening. Finally, Kevin Lane's grip faltered as blood seeped from his palms. He dropped his long sword, turned his horse, and fled. The knights under Kevin's command hoisted Mrs. Loving onto a horse and followed their leader in retreat. Seeing her captured, Charles Justice's eyes reddened with fury. Clutching his broadsword, he pursued them on foot. Locking onto the back of one knight, he hurled his weapon with precision. The broadsword pierced the knight's heart, dragging him off his horse. Charles Justice quickly caught up, retrieved his broadsword, and seized the fallen knight's horse to continue the chase. Kevin Lane, after riding some distance, reined in his horse and looked back. Upon seeing that his men had successfully captured Mrs. Loving, he felt a surge of relief and immediately ordered the remaining knights to block Charles Justice. Mrs. Loving urgently cried out, "Go find Master Lucas Sage to save me. Don't fight them head-on." But Charles Justice ignored her plea. Gripping his broadsword, he spurred his horse forward, undeterred by the knights, who had turned back to form a defensive line against him. Without hesitation, he charged. Kevin Lane, speaking in Turkic, commanded, "Take Miss Loving to young Master Tothu's quarters." 2 knights promptly obeyed, gagging Mrs. Loving and galloping away. Seeing Mrs. Loving being taken by the 2 knights, Charles Justice grew increasingly alarmed. He shouted at the top of his lungs, "Release Miss Loving now, or I'll kill every last one of you." Kevin Lane let out a soft chuckle, taking a steel spear from a knight, and stepping forward to confront Charles Justice. This time, he skillfully dodged the opponent's horizontal blade and, taking advantage of an opening, knocked the weapon aside. His subordinates immediately threw ropes, binding Charles Justice tightly. Charles Justice began hurling curses, but Kevin Lane quickly gagged him with a torn piece of cloth and said, "Whatever you're saying, we can't understand it, so don't waste your breath." Handing his weapon to his subordinate, Kevin Lane then took a white cloth to bandage the 2 wounds on his palms. Suddenly, the weather shifted, dark clouds rolled in, and rain began to pour heavily. Kevin Lane exclaimed, "This cursed weather, one moment it's sunny, the next it's pouring rain. Let's head back quickly, or we'll be drenched." He ordered his men to lay Charles Justice horizontally across a horse, then led the knights northeastward. At that moment, 2 riders approached from the west. Spotting the carnage of dead horses, they stopped in their tracks. Blood mixed with rainwater flowed into a nearby hollow. A tall man wearing a straw hat dismounted carefully to inspect the scene and said, "It seems there was a fierce battle here not long ago. This horse's front leg was severed by a Tang cavalry blade, causing it to bleed out and die." These 2 were none other than William Blade and Ethan Williams, who had been tasked by Paul Loving to search for Mrs. Loving and Charles Justice in the Turkic region. The other knight also dismounted, crouching to examine the fallen warhorse. Nodding, he said, "Indeed, this was cut down by one of our horizontal blades." As rainwater washed over the ground, it revealed a glimmering object. The knight picked it up for closer inspection and found it was a silver earring.